walk in this morning and I'm thinking, how am I going to get some mileage out of this door? Dave's already figured out a way. I'm thinking maybe next week the topic is going to be knock and the door shall be open to you. What do you think? We'll see. We will see. But first of all, we have to deal with the fact that Easter is almost upon us. It comes kind of early this year, the first Sunday in April, so that means Easter is just a little over a month away, which means that the season known as Lent has already started in the more traditional Christian churches. Ash Wednesday was a week and a half ago, which is interesting in itself, but what really fascinates me is that week or so leading up to Ash Wednesday. You know what I'm talking about? Mardi Gras, right? Mardi Gras celebrations. All over the world they happen, but specifically what's best known to us is the one that happens down in New Orleans. And I've never been, but what's not to like? Parades, lots of jazz, gaudy, elaborate floats. Here's a little sample of the gaudy, elaborate floats. I'm not quite sure what's with the big, creepy clown heads, however. This would not be the place to go if you suffer from coulrophobia. Anyone know what coulrophobia is? Fear of clowns, right? Some people get really creeped out by clowns, and too much of that would not be a good thing. But as I said, I've not been, but I understand that it's quite a party. It's like everyone is thinking that, hey, once Lent starts, the partying is over, so let's get all wild and crazy and collect a lot of beads and eat and drink until we pass out. Then we'll spend the 40 days of Lent repenting for all of our sins, and then Easter comes along and we'll all be saved and forgiven, and we get to start the whole thing over again, right? Human beings are just infinitely fascinating to me, right? Lent starts, 40 days of fasting, abstinence, and repentance, and we get saved, or at least that's the story. Some sins, some guilt, some redemption, and then we get to do it all over again. And it's interesting because the stuff that we really need to be saved from is the stuff that we do to ourselves. So why do people insist on looking outside of themselves for someone or something to give them an escape hatch, for a solution, for someone or something to come in and save them? A good example of this, I was driving behind a car, and I know probably some of you have seen this bumper sticker before. On the back window said, "In case of rapture, this car will be unmanned." Now, there are groups of people who interpret scriptures rather literally, who believe that all true Christian believers will one day be transported bodily, picked up off the surface of the planet, and lifted into the sky to go off to heaven to be with Jesus. Now, we have to hope that among those people will not be airline pilots and people that are operating our nuclear power plants and that kind of thing. And you know, it's really the same level of consciousness that this bumper sticker, or actually license plate holder, represents. Got Christ, it's hell without him. Again, this idea of needing an external someone to come in and save us, or an escape hatch to get out of this terrible, terrible, horrible world. And you know, the idea is that everybody who doesn't get raptured and gets left behind, it's tough luck, because you're going to be here to be tortured by the Antichrist and his evil minions as they wreak havoc on the planet. And we think global warming is a problem. I prefer this bumper sticker, actually. There's another one here, I think. Come the rapture, can I have your car? If the car's going to be unmanned, I mean, no one's doing anything with it. We want to be practical, all right? And I poke fun, not just for the sake of poking fun, but because there's kind of a problem with the theology that's behind this whole idea. It encourages people to ignore what's happening on the planet right now in anticipation of something that's going to come along and solve it all for us. That great escape hatch in the sky where we get to get away from our problems, and we're encouraged not so much to worry about them right now. Everybody is focused on some event that's going to happen at some time in the undetermined future. We focus on salvation in the future, and what happens in the meantime? The world goes to hell in a bucket. So, if Lent is going to mean anything going forward, I think it needs to be a call to action, a time of awakening. And one of the things we want to wake up to is the fact that we're not powerless, that we have the power within us to turn things around. That's the message of the late, great Eric Butterworth. He wrote that wonderful book, Discover the Power Within You. It's a key message in the Unity movement, and he really drives home the point. Here's what he says. Civilizations have never been destroyed by outer conquest or divine fiat. Civilizations have risen and fallen by the rise and fall of human consciousness. The fall of Rome, for instance, was an inside job. If mankind is in trouble today, it is not because of the wrath of God, but because of the darkness in the minds of men. The kingdom of heaven is still within man, and the mind that was in Christ Jesus is in every one of us. We create our own heaven and hell right here by the things we think, say, and do. Nobody creates that for us, and nobody is going to rescue us from it. You hear people talk about the second coming. The second coming isn't something that's going to come from outside. In Unity, we say that the second coming is what happens when we finally get it. When we finally understand and show up in the world as the kind of person that Jesus was. Everyone has the capacity. Not everyone recognizes it. The good news here is that there is nothing that can't be changed or reversed if we're willing to wake up. It isn't about avoiding hell in the afterlife, it's about creating the kingdom of heaven right here. Now, the main thing I remember about Lent, after spending 8+ years attending Catholic schools, is that it was all about giving stuff up. Something kind of trivial, for children anyway, candy, soda, swearing. And there's nothing wrong with doing something like that to practice self-control. It's a good practice for discipline and self-control. But I would ask, why only during Lent? Eric Butterworth says, the same consciousness, the same mind that was in Jesus is in every one of us. So, maybe instead of just giving stuff up for Lent, we might consider doing something positive to help us to recognize and manifest that consciousness and that mind. And my suggestion this morning comes from a book we worked with a few years ago called The 21 Skills of Spiritual Intelligence by Cindy Wigglesworth. There it is. The practice I'm talking about is called living with soul. Living with soul. And I'm not talking about James Brown here. SOUL is an acronym, and here's what the acronym stands for. SOUL stands for stop, observe, understand, and then find a loving response. This is something that we can use anytime, anywhere, to help us in that all-important practice of tapping into that Christ mind or that Christ consciousness that we all have, but often have difficulty locating, recognizing, and expressing. So, we start with step 1, which is simply stop. In the face of something that threatens to trigger us into a conversation or actions that would lead to disharmony and that kind of thing, we simply stop. It's the simplest and probably the most difficult step. We literally need to stop. and insert a pause. Insert a brief pause so that we have time to breathe, and then maybe ask a guiding question or two. Pausing. If we can remember to do that, that's half the battle. Anyone remember as a child being taught to count to 10 before you speak or act when you're in an emotional situation, when there's an emotional trigger coming up? You're taught to count to 10. It's supposed to be a way of controlling our temper. And guess what? It works. It really, really works. From a biological standpoint, they say that it takes just 6 seconds between the trigger and a full-blown ego reaction. 6 seconds is actually a lot of time. That was almost an uncomfortable pause, wasn't it? It's a lot of time when you think about it. 6 seconds is all that it takes. 6 seconds is more than enough time to stop and to consciously make a decision then to breathe. To take a couple, 3, 4 long, slow, deep breaths. And we do that because, well, of course, breathing is a very good thing. We want to keep doing that, but from a biological standpoint, slow, deep breaths bring about a physical change in the brain. Neuroscience demonstrates that when we face a threat, what happens is our sympathetic nervous system gets triggered. And it gets triggered not just by physical threats, but part of the price we pay for evolution is that we get triggered or threatened by, and we react to a lot more than just physical threats these days. We now react to things that threaten our self-esteem, our status, our self-image. So the threat triggers our sympathetic nervous system the same way a saber-toothed tiger would. Criticism can trigger our nervous system in the same way that a wild animal getting ready to eat us might. Triggers our flight or fight response. Now that's a good thing in the face of a real predator, but it doesn't work so well in the face of those other kinds of threats. And do you think that might be the reason why we experience conflict and disharmony in our lives? That's one of the things that happens. A threat triggers an adrenaline rush. It moves the blood out of that part of our brain that's responsible for logic and other higher mind functions, which explains why we tend to say stupid things in the heat of the moment. You know what I'm talking about, right? Yes. 2 seconds after we say it, we're thinking, now why did I go ahead and say that, right? There's the phenomenon of seeing red. Anyone know, you just kind of have this blank, and all of a sudden this stuff comes out of your mouth, and we're thinking, oh boy, wish I could take it back, but that's tough to do. It's hard to unring the bell. Something else that happens during the flight or fight response is our breathing becomes rapid and shallow. We're trying to pump oxygen to our muscles to get ready to flee or to fight. So, if we can pause, take a few long, calm breaths. We make sure that the part of the brain that's responsible for reason and logic is getting enough blood, and we send a message to the rest of our body that really all is well. There's no real threat present. We pause, we breathe consciously, and then the next part is to ask. Ask a guiding question, such as, what would Jesus do? Or, what would the Buddha do? What would love or wisdom or compassion do in this situation? And even if we don't get an immediate answer, we're still creating additional space around what might be a habitual reaction. Just asking the question at least gets us pointed in the right direction. What is the wise and compassionate thing to do in this situation? Is there an example that I can follow? What can I do to create the highest and best outcome for everyone? And I think you can see that you don't have to be a member of a particular religion in order to do this. For Christians, what would Jesus do? For Buddhists, what would Buddha do? What would love do? What would compassion do? So the next letter in SOUL, our acronym here, stands for observe. We've paused, taken a few breaths, we've asked the question, and now we have a little time to maybe step back and look at the situation as an objective witness to what's going on. We look and we focus on the three dimensions of our experience. Every experience we have has at least these three dimensions: our bodily sensations, our emotions, feelings, and our thoughts. What's going on in the body? Are we tense? Are my fists clenched? Is my jaw set? What's going on in the body? Can we name the emotions that are arising? What am I experiencing right now emotionally? Anxiety? Fear? Shame? What's being triggered? Being able to name these emotions is a step toward taking away the power of emotions to control us. They're there. We're going to feel them. We name them to make sure that they're not running the show. That's when we can turn to our thoughts. Our thoughts are what tell the stories about what's going on. And very often our thoughts tell us a story that wants us to give our power away. And what I mean by that are thoughts that tell a story like, oh, he made me angry. That's giving our power away. Or he insulted me. The outside world has absolutely no power to do any of that unless we choose to make it happen. We're angry because we are allowing that to happen. We are insulted because that's the story that we're telling about the situation, and we're allowing ourselves to experience that. We're 100% responsible for our emotions and our feelings. What we're doing in that situation is we're telling the ego, thanks for sharing, I've heard your little story, now chill out. I've got this. Sometimes there may be a threat. The ego isn't always wrong, but it has a tendency to want to go over the top. So we look carefully, we observe, and then we move to the next step, which is understanding. Why is the ego part of me interpreting this as a threat? Or why is this situation, this conversation, whatever it is, why is it bothering me so much? What do I need to understand here? Understanding requires empathy. That's why this is such a great practice. Understanding requires us to be willing to take the perspective of the other person. Now, the ego thinks it knows. It knows exactly what the other person means when they're saying something that bugs us. The ego knows why they're doing that. They did it because they're a jerk. They're inconsiderate, they're judgmental, they're evil, blah, 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 whatever it is. The ego knows. Or does it? Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're stressed out. Maybe they're just terribly worried and distracted because of some bad news that they got earlier in the day. Sick. Who knows? The fact is that we really don't know. We really don't know exactly why somebody says something that they say. Our reactionary snap judgment isn't the only possible conclusion. And understanding encourages us to consider other possibilities, especially those possibilities that would allow us to behold that all-important Christ mind or higher self in the other person. Which brings us to the last step in the process. Find a loving response. A response that's wise and compassionate. And that usually starts with gratitude. That's one way to help to bring that about. Gratitude. Thank you for letting me see the big picture, both inside and outside. Thank you for letting me see another perspective. And perhaps all the response that's called for in that situation, in that moment, could be silence. Sometimes just nodding, calm silence is the best response. Sometimes we simply thank the person for pointing something out, for sharing whatever it is, and we can move on without becoming flustered, without becoming defensive, without ramping the situation up into a spiral of dysfunction and disharmony. That might make a bigger and more lasting and positive impression than anything else. We talk about living our truth. We talk about living that Christ presence, and this is one way to do that. When the ego runs the show, it looks for someone or something to blame or even attack. There it is, looking for that external escape hatch to avoid responsibility for what we're feeling, or to avoid responsibility for dealing with the stuff that somehow we've created in our world or in our life. It wants to run away, hide, disengage, or fight. Take your pick. When we let the Christ mind run the show, it's going to help us to find what's right and what's good in every one and in every part of every situation. It looks for what is true and good and beautiful, and then it helps us to build on that. So that's the way that we want to learn how to show up in the world. That's the kind of lesson that we want to teach. We have that opportunity to engage in that practice a little more intensively during Lent, but I encourage all of us to take this and to put it into our little spiritual toolbox and try to use it 365 days a year. So as we step into the Easter season, we're going to be talking a little bit more on these themes starting again next week. And something else we're going to be doing is beginning at, let's say 11:30ish after the service, we'll have a chance if some of you want to get together and talk about some of these topics or have some questions about what we're talking about during the Easter season. We'll take about a half hour or 20 minutes to have a little Q&A and discussion. We will probably be in the youth ed room, and if that's not available, we'll be up in the office around the big round table. So we'll find a place to meet. Stay tuned. We'll let you know where when we're in Manning Hall. And until then, have a wonderful week. I'll see you next Sunday.